You know, movies are made by many, many things and people, but one of the things that make a movie is the movie. It contributes to making itself.
Francis Ford Coppola is not just a great director, he is a daredevil, willing to challenge Hollywood itself to make films his own way. He was nearly fired 4 times while making The Godfather, labeled a sabotager by his own studio, yet he went on to create one of the greatest films in cinematic history. He is the only director in history to guide 2 actors to win Oscars for portraying the same character, Marlon Brando and Robert De Niro in The Godfather and The Godfather Part 2. But every triumph comes at a cost. In his pursuit of artistic passion, Coppola burned through his fortune, lost his influence, shouldered massive debts, and at one point even contemplated suicide. From a paralyzed boy bullied for his appearance to a revolutionary director who reshaped Hollywood, only to be cast aside by the very system he once dominated, his is a story of defiance, reckless gambles, and a tragic downfall. Genius or madman? Did Hollywood exalt or destroy Francis Ford Coppola? This is a story that will make you think. Francis Ford Coppola was born on April 7, 1939 in Detroit, Michigan, but grew up in an Italian immigrant family in New York. His father, Carmine Coppola, was a flutist for the NBC Symphony Orchestra, but his career never reached the success he had hoped for. His mother, Italia Pennino Coppola, was an amateur actress who nurtured a love for the arts in their household. However, Coppola was not the favorite child in the family. His unusual appearance often made him feel like an outsider. His family life was unstable, constantly moving due to his father's work, forcing Coppola to attend 23 different schools before finally graduating from Great Neck North High School. At school, he was bullied for his looks, particularly at a military academy, where classmates mocked him with the nickname Ichabod. But he had another nickname, Science, thanks to his passion for technology and engineering, a fascination that no one could have predicted would later aid his filmmaking. A major turning point came at age 9, when Coppola was stricken with polio, leaving him bedridden for much of his childhood. Once an energetic child, he became trapped in his own body, unable to go outside or play like other kids. To entertain himself, he created puppet shows in his bed, performing for an audience of 1, himself, unknowingly honing his innate storytelling ability. Coppola soon became immersed in the world of cinema. He watched countless television programs, particularly drawn to Universal's horror films and the editing style of Sergei Eisenstein. He also started experimenting with filmmaking by re-editing 8mm family home videos, crafting short narratives like The Rich Millionaire and The Lost Wallet. When he finally regained mobility, he began shooting small films with a home camera, inventing stories and figuring out how to tell them visually. No one could have guessed that this camera would shape the future of one of cinema's greatest directors. Growing up in an artistic family, Coppola idolized his older brother, an aspiring writer. At one point, he wanted to follow in his brother's footsteps and become a novelist, but theater and film ultimately pulled him in. At age 15, Coppola read A Streetcar Named Desire, 1947, and was instantly captivated by the power of theater and cinematic storytelling. That moment became a turning point, solidifying his decision to pursue the arts instead of a more conventional path. Initially, Coppola trained to become a professional musician. He mastered the tuba and even earned a music scholarship to the New York Military Academy. But despite his musical talent, he felt out of place in the military environment, and his true passion remained in storytelling. He later received a scholarship to Hofstra University, where he studied theater, but soon realized he disliked being confined to traditional stage performances. At Hofstra, Coppola was rebellious, frequently clashing with professors because he refused to follow conventional rules. He preferred to create on his own terms, experimenting with unconventional storytelling techniques, a trait that would later define his directorial style. After graduating, he was one of the few students accepted into UCLA's prestigious film program, where he crossed paths with Jim Morrison, future frontman of The Doors, and Paul Schrader, screenwriter of Taxi Driver. But talent did not guarantee immediate success. To survive, Coppola made a living by editing low-budget horror films for Roger Corman, the legendary producer of B-movies. He did whatever it took to stay afloat, learning how to cut films on minimal budgets, work under tight schedules, and even convince producers to spend more than they had planned, a skill that would later help him navigate the high-risk, big-budget projects that defined his career. After leaving UCLA, Coppola dived headfirst into Roger Corman's B-movie studio, a factory of cheap but effective films. There, he learned how to make movies fast, with minimal budgets, yet still find ways to be creative. A survival lesson that would follow him throughout his career. In 1963, he got his first opportunity to direct his own film, Dementia 13, a horror movie shot at record speed with a shoestring budget, utilizing whatever was available to cut costs. It wasn't a masterpiece, but it was enough to prove that Coppola had talent. More importantly, it made him realize that he didn't want to be stuck in the B-movie world. He wanted more. That opportunity came in 1968 when Hollywood handed him Finian's Rainbow, a bizarre musical starring Fred Astaire. It was his first time directing a big-budget film, but instead of feeling satisfied, he felt suffocated. The studio system was too rigid, and every decision he made was scrutinized. This was not how Coppola wanted to make films. So he did something few dared to do at the time. He walked away from Hollywood. Teaming up with George Lucas and Walter Murch, he founded American Zoetrope, an independent film studio with the dream of making movies their own way, free from the grip of major studios. It was a cinematic revolution, but independent filmmaking was no easy feat. Zoetrope's first project, THX 1138, directed by George Lucas, was a financial disaster. The young studio was in crisis, and Coppola was drowning in debt. Standing at the edge of collapse, Coppola had two choices. 1. Stay true to his ideals and let Zoetrope go bankrupt. 2. Take on a commercial project to make money and save the studio. He chose the second option. That film was The Godfather, and it was a decision that changed the history of cinema forever. At first, Francis Ford Coppola didn't even want to direct The Godfather. To him, Mario Puzo's novel was too sensational, too commercial, far from the kind of artistic film he wanted to make. But with Zoetrope on the brink of bankruptcy, he had no choice. Paramount offered him $125,000 and 6% of the box office revenue, an offer he couldn't afford to refuse in such desperate times. Reluctantly, Coppola took the job, stepping into one of the most tumultuous productions in cinema history. From the very beginning, Hollywood didn't trust him. To them, he was too young, too inexperienced, too stubborn. Throughout the production, he was nearly fired 4 times. The studio hated almost every decision he made. He wanted Al Pacino for the role of Michael Corleone. The studio said no. They wanted a bigger name, Robert Redford, Ryan O'Neal, or Warren Beatty. At the time, Pacino was unknown, not even meeting Hollywood's height standards. But Coppola refused to compromise, even threatening to walk away from the project if he didn't get Pacino. The studio reluctantly agreed, but only allowed Pacino to shoot a few test scenes. They hated his early performances, until the restaurant scene when Michael Corleone kills Sollozzo and the police captain. After that, they sat in stunned silence. The debate was over. He wanted Marlon Brando as Vito Corleone. The studio said no. Brando was considered washed up, difficult to work with, and known for sabotaging productions. But Coppola knew Brando was the only choice. To convince the studio, he arranged a secret screen test at Brando's house. As the camera rolled, Brando transformed, stuffing cotton in his cheeks, lowering his voice, and becoming the Godfather right before Coppola's eyes. The studio still resisted, but when they saw the footage, they had no choice but to accept. He wanted a minimalist visual style, dim lighting, a heavy atmosphere. The studio hated it. They called his cinematography too dark, too slow, too boring, and threatened to replace him. But Coppola held his ground, keeping his signature visual style intact, using Gordon Willis's lighting techniques to create one of the most iconic cinematographic works in history. Coppola worked under immense pressure. Paramount executives watched the dailies, constantly searching for an excuse to fire him. He knew that one mistake could cost him the director's chair, but he didn't back down. He fought for every detail, from the cinematography to the casting, holding on to the vision he believed in. When The Godfather premiered on March 24, 1972, it wasn't just a success. It was an earthquake. It became the highest-grossing film of 1972, earning over $250 million worldwide, a record-breaking number at the time. It won 3 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Adapted Screenplay, and Best Actor for Marlon Brando, who famously refused to accept the award. Al Pacino, an unknown before the film, became a Hollywood legend. Brando redefined cinematic acting with his transformation into Vito Corleone. Coppola, once dismissed as an unproven filmmaker, became the most powerful director in Hollywood. The success of The Godfather led Paramount to demand an immediate sequel. Coppola didn't want to return to the world of the mafia, but this time he had the power to decide. And so The Godfather Part 2 was born, continuing to make history. Hollywood wanted profits, a follow-up film to capitalize on the groundbreaking success of the first Godfather. Initially, Coppola planned to decline, but when the studio threatened to find another director, he changed his strategy. If he had to make a sequel, he would do it on his own terms, without following any of Hollywood's conventions. He set forth what seemed like an impossible demand: total creative control, no studio interference, the right to write the screenplay, full authority over the production, and most importantly, the film had to be titled The Godfather Part 2. At the time, Hollywood had never numbered a sequel before. The studio objected, fearing that audiences would assume it was simply a split version of the original. But Coppola stood firm. If they didn't accept his conditions, he would walk away. Left with no choice, Paramount conceded. Unlike most sequels that simply continue a story, The Godfather Part 2 did something revolutionary. It told 2 parallel narratives across 2 different timelines. One storyline followed Michael Corleone, Al Pacino, in the 1950s, as he became increasingly ruthless, losing his family and his very soul in the pursuit of power. The other storyline took audiences back in time, chronicling the rise of a young Vito Corleone, Robert De Niro, from a poor Sicilian immigrant forced to flee his homeland to his transformation into a feared and respected crime boss in America. These 2 interwoven tales mirrored each other, creating an epic tragedy about power, betrayal, and the cost of ambition. Once again, Coppola took a massive risk, refusing to alter his screenplay despite studio opposition. He also bet on Robert De Niro, casting him as young Vito Corleone, even though De Niro had to learn Italian and perform almost the entire film in a foreign language. The result? A cinematic shockwave. When The Godfather Part 2 premiered in 1974, it didn't just succeed, it rewrote Hollywood's rules. With a budget of $13 million, nearly double that of the first film, it grossed over $93 million worldwide, proving that an artistically ambitious film could still be a commercial blockbuster. But more importantly, it elevated Coppola to an unprecedented height in his career. The film won 6 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Director, Best Supporting Actor, De Niro, and Best Adapted Screenplay. It became the first sequel in history to win Best Picture, setting a precedent for major film franchises to follow. Coppola became the only director to lead 2 different actors to win Oscars for playing the same character: Marlon Brando in the first film and Robert De Niro in the second. Critics and audiences hailed it as the greatest sequel of all time, with many even considering it superior to the original. As Coppola stood on the Oscar stage holding the golden statue, he had silenced all doubts, achieving a triumphant victory, both artistically and financially. After The Godfather, all of Hollywood expected Coppola to follow up with another massive blockbuster. But instead of capitalizing on his newfound power, he took a completely different direction, choosing to make a minimalist film with no gangsters, no bloodshed, but rather a suffocating psychological story about obsession and isolation. The Conversation had no powerful mafia figures or brutal executions. Instead, it delved deep into the mind of a surveillance expert, Harry Call, Gene Hackman, a man tormented by his own work. When he records a conversation that could lead to murder, Harry spirals into paranoia, questioning whether he is merely an observer or an accomplice to a crime. But The Conversation wasn't just a film about paranoia, it became a chilling prophecy. Coppola had written the script in 1966, simply intrigued by surveillance technology. But by the time the film was released in 1974, America had changed completely. The Watergate scandal had just exploded, shaking the nation with revelations of government wiretapping under the Nixon administration. Suddenly, The Conversation was no longer fiction. It had become a real warning, forcing audiences to stare at the screen and ask themselves, can we even trust our own privacy anymore? Even Coppola himself was stunned that his small film had become a mirror reflecting an America drowning in doubt and fear. Beyond its powerful message, The Conversation redefined how sound was used in cinema. Coppola collaborated with Dolby Labs, employing advanced techniques to turn sound into a character itself. Distorted conversations, repeated phrases, words that were sometimes clear, sometimes fragmented. It all created a suffocating sense of unease, making the audience feel as if they too were being watched, slowly becoming as obsessed as the protagonist. The film laid the groundwork for modern sound design, influencing later masterpieces like Blade Runner and The Social Network. Though it wasn't a commercial blockbuster, The Conversation sent shockwaves through the critical world. At the 1974 Cannes Film Festival, it received a standing ovation and won the festival's highest honor, the Palme d'Or. But the most extraordinary moment came during that year's Oscar race. Coppola found himself in an unprecedented situation, competing against himself. Both The Conversation and The Godfather, Part 2, were nominated for Best Picture. Throughout the night, Hollywood watched in suspense. Could Coppola actually beat himself? In the end, The Godfather Part 2 took home the Oscar, but that did nothing to diminish The Conversation's legacy. Coppola had proven that he was not just a mafia director, he was a master storyteller with an unparalleled vision. What started as a film written out of curiosity became a terrifying glimpse into the future. A groundbreaking work that forever changed the role of sound in cinema, and a defining moment in Coppola's career. He may have returned to the world of the mafia soon after, but with The Conversation, he had already proven one thing: he could do anything, and he could do it brilliantly. After leaving his mark on cinema, Francis Ford Coppola announced that he would make a film about the Vietnam War. No one realized he was about to plunge into the greatest nightmare of his life. The film was shot in the Philippines, a bold and costly decision. On the first day of shooting, Coppola sensed that something was wrong. A few weeks later, the nightmare began. Martin Sheen, the film's lead actor, suffered a heart attack in the middle of filming, nearly dying on set. When Sheen was rushed to the hospital, Coppola kept the incident secret, fearing that the studio would shut down the project immediately. But the disasters didn't stop there. Marlon Brando, the biggest star of the film, arrived on set overweight, unprepared, and without having memorized a single line. He flat out refused to perform as scripted, demanding that Coppola rewrite the entire film for him. While the director struggled to manage Brando, a tropical storm tore through the set, destroying almost everything. Everything began to collapse. The budget spiraled out of control, and the production dragged on indefinitely. Coppola, who had mortgaged his personal assets to finance the film, became buried in debt, and suffered a severe psychological breakdown. He endured relentless insomnia, epileptic seizures, hallucinations, and at one point even contemplated suicide. In a later interview, he admitted, "We had been in the jungle too long. We had gone insane." When the film was finally completed, Coppola didn't know if he had created a masterpiece or a disaster. Apocalypse. Now premiered at the 1979 Cannes Film Festival in an unfinished version. When the screening ended, the audience stood in applause for 11 straight minutes. Coppola won the Palme d'Or, one of the most prestigious awards in cinema. But no accolade could erase what he had endured. Apocalypse Now was not just a war film, it was war itself. Every moment of the filmmaking process mirrored the chaos, madness, and loss of control of the Vietnam War. From storms wiping out entire sets, to actors losing their grip, and a director teetering on the edge of self-destruction, everything became a part of the film, a real-life descent into destruction and insanity. Today, Apocalypse Now is regarded as the greatest war film of all time, but the price Coppola paid was staggering. After this nightmare, he was no longer the same man who had walked into the Philippine jungle years before. The film had destroyed him, but it had also made him immortal. After conquering Hollywood with The Godfather and Apocalypse Now, Francis Ford Coppola dreamed of a new Hollywood, one where filmmakers could create without being controlled by commercial studios. To bring this vision to life, he poured his own money into building Zoetrope Studios, an independent film company dedicated to artistic freedom, unbound by financial constraints. But that very ambition would push Coppola to the brink of ruin. The first film of this dream was One from the Heart, 1982. It was an all-or-nothing gamble. Coppola mortgaged his house, borrowed millions of dollars, and built an entirely new studio, determined to control every visual aspect of the film. He wanted to revolutionize filmmaking by shooting entirely on a soundstage, using cutting-edge lighting technology. But the nightmare began the moment the film was released. The budget ballooned to $26 million, an astronomical figure at the time. But when it hit theaters, One from the Heart grossed a mere $600,000. A catastrophic failure. Not only did Coppola lose every dollar he had invested, but he was also left drowning in over $50 million of debt, a devastating sum for an independent director. Zoetrope Studios went bankrupt soon after, forcing him to sell off everything he owned just to stay afloat. Coppola, once revered as Hollywood's greatest genius, became its biggest failure. Studios lost faith in him. He was seen as a cautionary tale of arrogance, a living example that no one could make films without the backing of the studio system. Stripped of his independence, Coppola had no choice but to return to making commercial films, taking on projects that no longer ignited his passion. And so, the man who once set Hollywood ablaze with revolutionary masterpieces was now making films just to pay off his debts. Films like The Outsiders, 1983, and Peggy Sue Got Married, 1986. These weren't bad films, but they no longer carried the rebellious spirit that once made Hollywood tremble. In retrospect, Coppola's downfall became a pivotal moment in film history. While directors like George Lucas and James Cameron would later finance their own films and achieve monumental success, Coppola was the pioneer who failed. The dream of independent Hollywood that he built collapsed before his eyes, leaving behind a bitter lesson. No one could stand alone against the studio system, at least not at that time. And as the 1980s came to a close, one looming question remained. Could Coppola ever return to the top, or was this the end of his legendary career? Francis Ford Coppola may be a cinematic legend, but his life has played out like a tragic film he could not direct himself, marked by loss and secrets. In 1963, he married Eleanor Jessie Neal, a writer and documentary filmmaker who would later co-direct the acclaimed documentary Hearts of Darkness, A Filmmaker's Apocalypse, chronicling the harrowing behind-the-scenes ordeal of Apocalypse Now. They had 3 children, Giancarlo Coppola, Roman Coppola, and Sofia Coppola, all of whom followed in their father's footsteps in the film industry. But tragedy struck in 1986, when Giancarlo Coppola died at the age of 22 in a horrific speedboat accident. At the time, he was riding with Griffin O'Neill, son of Ryan O'Neill, when their boat collided with a tow line of another vessel, killing Giancarlo instantly. Griffin O'Neill survived, but was later charged with involuntary manslaughter due to reckless operation of the boat. For Coppola, this loss was more devastating than any failure he had ever endured. A man who had withstood the overwhelming pressure of Apocalypse Now, who had fought against Hollywood's most powerful executives, was now crushed by a single phone call delivering the worst news imaginable. He shut down, unable to speak to anyone for months, mourning the artistic heir he had pinned so many hopes on. In an effort to keep his son's memory alive, he named Giancarlo's daughter Gia Coppola, a symbolic way to ensure his son's spirit continued. But no matter what he did, the void remained unfillable. Adding to the turmoil during the years of The Godfather Part 2 and Apocalypse Now, Coppola had an affair with Melissa Matheson, who would later become the screenwriter of E.T. the Extraterrestrial. At the time, Matheson was just an assistant on set, but their relationship lasted for years and nearly led to Coppola and Eleanor's divorce. The family survived the storm, but the scars of that betrayal lingered beneath the surface of what seemed like an unshakable marriage. And then, on April 12, 2024, Eleanor Coppola passed away at the age of 87. The woman who had stood by his side for over 6 decades, who had witnessed and documented both his greatest triumphs and his deepest downfalls, was now gone. There were no grand statements, no sorrowful interviews. Coppola simply faced the quiet, unavoidable truth that the most important people in his life were slipping away, one by one. Looking back on the life of Francis Ford Coppola, audiences universally acknowledge that he was not just a great director, he was a filmmaker who changed the landscape of Hollywood itself. He was a pioneer of the new Hollywood movement, paving the way for legends like Steven Spielberg, Martin Scorsese, and George Lucas, visionaries who inherited and continued the cinematic revolution he helped ignite. In the history of cinema, only one director has ever guided 2 actors to win Oscars for portraying the same character, and that director is Coppola. This rare feat, achieved by Marlon Brando and Robert De Niro as Vito Corleone, is something only a handful of performers have ever accomplished, cementing Coppola's extraordinary artistic eye and his ability to turn films into legends. Despite the turbulence of his career, Coppola was recognized by Entertainment Weekly as the 21st greatest director of all time, an honor that rightfully reflects his irreplaceable contributions to cinema. But Hollywood was never his entire world. Since 1978, he had been building Rubicon Estate, transforming it into one of the most prestigious wineries in America. To Coppola, winemaking was no different from filmmaking. It was a creative journey with no final destination. Yet perhaps the most surprising twist in his story is that for decades, Hollywood refused to honor him properly. It wasn't until 2022 that Coppola was finally awarded a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, placed in front of Musso and Frank Grill, an iconic location of the film industry. It was a long overdue recognition, but Coppola never needed Hollywood's validation to become a legend. He built his legacy in a way that no one could ever replace. At 86, Francis Ford Coppola remains relentless in his artistic ambitions, undeterred by financial challenges and recent setbacks. In 2024, he self-funded and released Megalopolis, a science fiction epic he had been developing for over 40 years. However, the film failed to achieve the success he had hoped for, grossing only $14.6 million against a $120 million budget. Coppola even received a Razzie Award for Worst Director. To finance the film, he sold 2 of his vineyards and took out loans. further straining his financial situation. Yet, despite these struggles, he refuses to abandon his cinematic dreams. Coppola is already planning future projects, including an adaptation of Edith Wharton's novel, The Glimpses of the Moon and Continuing Distant Vision, an experimental film project he has pursued since 2015. Additionally, he is serving as executive producer for Brother vs. Brother, a film by Ari Gold, inspired by Coppola's own concept of live cinema. Though critics and audiences remain skeptical, he remains steadfast in his artistic vision, constantly exploring new storytelling techniques. Beyond filmmaking, Coppola continues to be honored for his immense contributions to the arts. In 2024, he received the Capitoline Wolf, Rome's highest honor, and a street in the city was named after him, reflecting his deep connection to European culture. That same year, the Kennedy Center honored him, with longtime friend George Lucas introducing him by saying, "What Francis does in creativity is jump off a cliff. When you spend enough time with Francis, you start believing you can jump off a cliff too." In April 2025, Coppola is set to receive the American Film Institute's AFI Lifetime Achievement Award, further solidifying his lasting legacy and profound impact on cinema. Despite Megalopolis's failure, Coppola remains unwavering in his desire to revolutionize the film industry. He continues to embody artistic bravery, innovation, and an unyielding creative spirit, forging ahead against all odds to pursue his singular vision. Francis Ford Coppola didn't just make films. He set fire to every boundary. A genius or a madman, a legend or Hollywood's most reckless gambler. He changed cinema forever, but at an enormous cost. Yet is the line between visionary brilliance and self-destruction ever truly clear? At his peak, he was the most powerful man in Hollywood, commanding multi-million-dollar blockbusters. But he also gambled his entire fortune, $50 million, on a misguided bet that led him to the brink of bankruptcy. Decades later, he poured over $120 million into Megalopolis, a 40-year dream that ended in crushing failure. Did Coppola go too far? Or was this simply the price of true genius? Was he a pioneer or a cautionary tale? A source of inspiration or an inevitable tragedy? Coppola, master or madman? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more emotional deep dives into the legends of Hollywood.